Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm here to introduce Peter Jerkowitz, who's joining us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Analogies are a powerful, memorable way of understanding and communicating complex ideas. Each of us can learn to understand the impact that group dynamics have on the choices we make and how to improve both the decisions and the interactions with those around us. Peter Jerkowitz is a former Microsoftie, which many of you, I think, know. He's worked in Dynamics, release management in Windows, DevDiv setup, IE sustained engineering, and the natural languages group. Peter is currently the founder and CEO of NovusWorks. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. So, first, thank you guys for taking time out of what I know is a busy schedule to be here, and to the folks that I know are online, thank you for being here as well. Just wanted to set ground rules for today. So, two things I want to talk about. One is I'm going to pull a couple of analogies out of the book so that we can explore them in a little bit more detail and talk about them, just to kind of explore some of the messaging in them, but also to help support the second point, which is I wanted to share a little bit with you guys as to why using analogies works in leading people and in kind of managing yourself, right? At least why in my journey it's worked for me. As Amy just told you guys, I am a former Microsoft person as well. I was here for going on 19 years, left a couple years ago to pursue the passion that is more around improving business operations and focusing on developing and growing people. And that's what NovusWorks is really all about. As part of that, I took what turned out to be a natural side effect of the way I did my job when I was here, which was in mentoring people and growing teams. I discovered that I kind of have this talent of making up analogies. And in that journey, we took some of those analogies and put them to press, right? So all of these analogies that are in the book were invented in the heat of a moment of me trying to explain something to somebody, right? So they're all of them, it's where they all came from. So as we go through this today, feel free to ask questions. I'm going to try to keep us moving because I know some people probably have a tighter schedule, but if things come up along the way, feel free to interrupt and ask. So with that, let's talk about digging holes. First one is, the analogy is called digging the perfect hole in the wrong place, right? And if you start off thinking about the work that we do day to day, we're all involved in doing a project, we're all doing a task, we're all trying to make something happen, right? And to me, that's digging a hole, right? And we're all working on it, and we all put great passion into digging the hole. We put great passion into making sure it's a perfect hole. All of us have studied different aspects of life, engineering, computer science, etc. We bring all of those things into digging that hole to where we end up with a perfect hole. The issue, though, is we're not digging just any hole, we're digging perfect holes. We're digging holes that take hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks to dig. And of course, they took substantial professional skills. So put yourself now in it's time to be evaluated for this hole, right? You're in the project review, you're in your annual review maybe, and it's time to understand exactly what is going on with this hole. Here's the rub, is the business is going to look at this hole differently than we do, right? So the business, we are going to look at the hole first by looking at the effort that it took to dig it. We're going to look at exactly how quality it is, and lastly, we think about the value of it, right? It turns out the business is going to look at it very, very differently, right? So the business is going to look at what is the value of the hole, right? You see these two swapped. It's going to look at what is the value of the hole. Then it's going to look at what is the quality of the hole. And then it's going to decide how much effort it took to dig it, right? So when you think about annual reviews, and all of us want to get great big bonuses, bonuses get paid if You did something that's valuable, that's at quality, and oh, by the way, if it was really, really hard, the bonus may get ticked for it. The promotion may get recognized for it, but it doesn't come with effort first. It's the other way around. And one of the things that I sum it up with is this notion that the business would rather have a rough chip in the right place than it would to have a perfect hole in the wrong place, right? And some of you guys may have actually experienced that when you dig a perfect hole in the wrong place, sometimes to the business, to your team, this is actually, it's a huge loss, right? Because not only is the opportunity cost of you weren't over here digging, where maybe you should have been digging, but the business has actually got to stop and put dirt in this crazy hole that's now in this place that we don't want a hole, right? So it's actually a net loss, right? So, kind of the core of this analogy says, hey, keep your passion and focus on digging great holes, right? That's not the problem. The effort that it takes to make it right is right. The fact that sometimes we have to work a little longer to get the thing to be correct, that's not a problem. The problem is we need to ensure that we're always digging in the right place. That means that for each of us as individual contributors, we need to be validating ourselves with our managers, with the other leads, with the team that we're working with. Is this the right hole in the right place? Right? Which means, first off, think it through for yourself as a professional. Is it the right thing for the business? The second one is seek validation, right? But do remember that even after you seek validation and you're digging in the right place, sometimes the definition of right changes, right? That features need to be changed, schedules put things under constraints, customers suddenly ask for things that we didn't know they were going to ask for. The definition of right can and often does change. It's up to us to keep an eye on it, right? And remember that the business ultimately decides the definition of right, right? And what I mean by that is, as individuals, we don't get to decide this is the correct answer. I can't help it that the business isn't smart enough to understand that. That's not a fair response, right? Because the business ultimately is the definer. It's up to us to validate with it. Doesn't mean that we may not try to convince the business, to convince our team, to convince our manager, et cetera, that I think I understand something that maybe the business doesn't. Absolutely want to do that. But we can't just go do what we think is right and assume everybody's going to see the brilliance of it. But then for the business, for those of us that are leaders in the room, we can look at this from that angle too and say, hey, first thing, two things that a leader must know is where should your team be digging, right? Do you have an opinion? Do you know where the hole should be being put from your team? And the second one is, do you know where your team is digging? Although the individual has skin in the game to make sure that they're digging in the right place, so does the manager. The manager's got skin in the game to make sure that they have not only said where is right, but they know where their team is digging. So if you're a manager and you're surprised that somebody's digging someplace that you didn't know they were digging, that's a shame on you, right? That's not you paying attention. Make sense? So second thing, why analogies work real quick. And this is just from my experience, the way I kind of developed this as I went. So first, three things. One is, analogies allow us to depersonalize messages, right? And this one you may have heard of, but it's the notion that says, if somebody is digging in the wrong place, instead of saying, you're working on stuff that nobody's going to value, you have a depersonalized way of saying, how do we know we're digging in the right place? And because of the indirect language, because we can stop and have this indirect conversation before we have the direct conversation of the value, it actually makes it easier for people to hear it, right? And this phenomenon is where all of the analogies came from for me, right? It was an ability, we could actually stop and explore relatively complex things and then apply them back to work, right? Which is why I say it's a depersonalized discussion with a personal message, right? Because ultimately, if we stop and we visit with somebody about, how do you know you're digging in the right place, right? How do you know that it's got the right quality? And you start having those conversations, what you're really doing is setting up to bring it back to reality of, let's talk about the specific task you're working on. Let's talk about the specific set of test cases you're writing. Let's talk about the specific set of bugs that you're choosing to fix, etc. Make sense? So the second one, and this is the one that this is where I describe what goes on in my head as I develop these really. And it really comes down to, I think about it as the big pause button, right? And what it means is, for me, is two things. One is, I think about you're on the game field, so you're literally in the situation room having the conversation over triaging bugs, or you're having a hard conversation over managing a schedule. You're having the hard conversation over, we're going to change the team and do a reorg. You're having the hard conversation over feature lists, what's in, what's out, right? So it's literally in the game. But the second thing that you can do is realize that there is this observatory. And to my mind's eye, what you can do is you can push pause and you can stand back and you can look at what's going on and figure out, what's the real play that's going on here, right? So literally where digging the perfect hole came from was me as a manager in the review process with somebody in my office who worked really hard, but they didn't actually do the right work. Me explaining to them that we valued the work, but not at the level they did, because it was in the wrong place, right? And it was me using an analogy to really get them to understand where we dig is more important than how we dig, right? So by being able to push the pause button and step up to the observatory, we can look at the game field. And you can actually begin to understand what's at play. And here in a minute, I'll walk us through another one that is the same notion of really thinking about what's in play, and then you can come back and push the play button again and you're back in the game. But you now have this perspective and you have this language that you can use to actually influence the game now. The third one is using the analogy almost as a tagline in everyday language, right? So to be able to say to somebody, how do you know you're digging in the right place, is a really, really important aspect, because it can show up in conversation and you can pack a whole lot of message in a very small set of words, right? And if you look in the book, there's 9 analogies in there, and the titles of those analogies are intentionally geared to become part of language, right? Because the more people that knew the titles, you'd be able to insert this entire chapter of content into those 3 little words to go influence a conversation, a situation. So, are you digging in the right spot? Here in a moment we'll talk about handling that ball of energy. But to give you an idea that there's some other ones that you guys have probably heard of, right? Let's cross that bridge when we come to it, is a very indirect way of saying we're trying to solve a problem now that we don't have right now. I agree we'll probably have it, but let's take care of it when it gets here, right? The new guy is green. There's a whole lot of pack in that says, if you hear this in a leadership conversation, what you're probably hearing somebody say is, let's be careful how much we rely on this person, right? Let's make sure they're supported. Let's make sure that we're putting the challenge on that they're ready to take on, right? Is all packed up inside this one little line, right? You guys have all heard of Murphy's Law, might be called the demo rule, right? That says something is going to go wrong, beware, right? But you could say beware of Murphy's Law, which is a whole lot better than saying, be very careful, your crap is going to break, right? Which obviously is going to be way more aggressive and it's not going to be heard quite the same way. Make sense? So then, our friend, the ball of energy. So the ball of energy is a challenge that says, have you guys ever been in a place where you've gotten some big news, where the big news came at a really inopportune time, right? Maybe you heard that your reorg and your position is going to change, and you heard about it, at the coffee machine. You heard about it in a really indirect, seemingly cold way, right? Which is to say that the person that gave it to you didn't seem to really understand how big this thing was, right? It was bad for you, right? It's a big deal for you, and the person that's delivering the message to you almost seemed happy about it, right? And what you'll see in a minute is what they really were wasn't happy, but they were relieved. But they seemed happy, right? And that certainly would seem inappropriate as you're getting it. Again, on the leadership side, have you ever delivered big news where you were surprised that when you put the news out on the table, the person actually had a much bigger reaction to it than you thought they were going to have? Or news that kept you up all night, right? If any of you have ever had the very unpleasant task of terminating somebody, right? That keeps you up all night long the night before because it's really, really big news to deliver and it's a lot of anxiety. You dread delivering it, right? So this ball of energy is all about communicating, right? At work, it's about communicating things like reorgs. It's about communicating things like somebody's going to take on a new position, or a position may have been cut, or an entire project is cut, right? It is review scores, sometimes the good ones and the bad ones, right? Tough feedback on ideas. We've all had the challenge of how you tell somebody this idea needs to change a little bit, but you know they're going to be resistant to it, right? And how you go deliver that. On the home side, right, just to show you that the analogies aren't just work, is it could be that you're moving cities, right? And it could be that you and your spouse or partner, you actually want to move the city, but it's still a big deal to come home and say, hey, I got the job and we're actually moving, right? It's a change in plans, right? And keep in mind, change in plans here, it could be that you need to tell one of your kids that the movie that I promised you we were going to go see tonight, we can't go see it, right? Which is a big deal to the kid, right? Could be you're breaking up with somebody, damage somebody's car. So the ball of energy mentally represents the size and impact of what this big news is. To my mind's eye, it's actually, and I looked long and hard trying to find a picture of a ball of energy. Turns out they're hard to photograph. But in mentally, just picture just a seething ball of energy, right, that represents what this big news is. And what's about to happen is you're about to go hand it to somebody, right? So the ball of energy is, it's passed from one party to another, right? And I can't not pass it. I can't tell you that you have a review score that's different than what I know you think you got without passing this ball of energy. I can't come home and tell you that I lost my position without passing you this ball of energy. I can't tell you didn't get the promotion. I can't tell you that we're going to take on a new challenge and this is the role that I need you to take. I can't deliver any of these without handing over this ball of energy, right? Do keep in mind it can be good news. It can be good news. It is impactful to the recipient, right? Because if you're about to hand something to somebody and it doesn't matter to them, then the ball of energy from their vantage point is going to be tiny. It doesn't really matter, right? So it has impact. And in fact, in many, many cases, the ball of energy is a very different size for both parties that are involved, right? So think about, go back to you're telling one of the kids in your family that we don't get to go to the movie. To the 7-year-old child, the movie that everybody gets to see this week, I suddenly don't. This is a big, big deal to them, right? To you, you weren't really necessarily that excited about the movie to begin with, and we're going to see it next Tuesday. The world's going to be okay. By the time they graduate high school, they won't remember this. You know it. But to them, it's actually a really, really big deal, right? So think about the experiences here. To the sender, when you are going to hand off this ball of energy, right? Typically you're stressed over how you're going to tell. And then the sensation that you're feeling here is certainly not pleasant, right? Because you know you're about to hand over this ball of energy, right? Typically, you're anxious to be done, which, I might add, makes you trigger happy, right? Because all you want to do is get rid of this thing. And quite frankly, how I get rid of it isn't nearly as interesting to me as actually getting rid of it, right? Oftentimes, we overreact to initial reactions when we hand off the ball of energy, right? So when you hand this ball of energy to somebody and they react, oftentimes we overreact, right? Because we're kind of keyed up ourselves. Doesn't always get the good news, isn't obvious part, is really saying, so in the book, the scenario is this, right? Is the easiest way for me to describe this. In the book, the scenario is that there is a senior leader that has to eliminate a person from a position, right? The character in the book isn't meeting the needs of the position, so she's going to be eliminated out of it. Need to get somebody else in it. But what they do in the middle of the night one night is figure out, wait a minute, I could create a position. And if I created a position that looked like this character would be perfect for it. So instead of this person losing a job, we're going to put her in this other position. This is fantastic news, right? But to her, when she receives the news, it's not good news, because what she sees is, I just lost my position from her vantage point, right? So oftentimes we deliver stuff that to the sender, it appears good because they've been on this journey of crafting it, but to the receiver, they're not there yet, right? And then always remember that the sender doesn't always get to choose not to send the news, right? Because if we're going to move buildings, right, I don't get to choose to not tell the team. I don't get to choose to tell you that we're not going to move buildings and this is where we're moving. Even though I know for you the commute is going to get worse and it's not a good news thing for you. I don't get to not tell you, right? To the receiver, they're typically hit out of the blue, right? For them, they're starting a journey and they go from 0 to 60 instantly, right? So if we stay with the example of we're about to move buildings and I know the commute is going to be worse for you, I've been thinking about this for days, if not weeks, this journey I've been on, right? Because we don't move buildings around here. It may seem like we do it suddenly, but it doesn't happen that way, right? So I've been thinking about this for a long time, but at the point that you tell the person and you finally put it on the table, they are instantly in a rapidly moving scenario, right? The very quick conversation usually happens because this person is just trying to get rid of the ball, right? All they're trying to do is hand it off. The other thing to remember is that to the receiver, the journey is unique, right? And probably if we stay with somebody's losing their job, the person that says you're losing their job is in a very, very different scenario than the person that actually lost their job. The person that needs to say you didn't get the promotion is in a very different situation than the person that didn't actually get the promotion, right? Or I want to work on a feature team, or, right? They're very, very different. It's confusing and scary. Oftentimes, you're expected to be back to normal very quickly, which is the notion that says, again, because the sender is oftentimes trying to get back to normal. They're trying to get back to, I don't have this ball of energy anymore. This energy that I don't like, this not pleasant part, I want it over. And the quicker I can get it back to normal, the better. So they often put a lot of pressure on that says, let's get back to normal quickly. But this person's journey may or may not allow them to do that. And this ask for agreement is, it's related to this, right? That says, I'm asking you to tell me we're back to normal. So then, the ball of energy. So when you're going to hand off one of these balls of energy, it's very important that you think about a few things. One of them is the timing and the space, right? Is it the right day and time for the receiver to receive it? When should you tell this person this news, right? Some of us, when you get challenging news, you need to go for a walk and you need to get back to work, right? That's the way you process this thing. Some of us would rather have the weekend to go think about it. Some of us, right? So you need to think about when you're going to hand off this ball of energy, what is the best way for this person to process this? And do they have room to react? And of course, don't jump the gun on delivery. Because remember, as a sender, we oftentimes, all we want to do is get rid of this ball of energy, right? Size of the change is, remember that the news that you're handing off may be of a very different size than the news the person is receiving, right? And it's very, very important for you to think about how big is this news to this other party, right? To where you can actually help them manage their experience. And then, of course, remember that they were just launched into a journey, right? And they may have been launched quite abruptly from their point of view, right? Even though it's midstream for you. So the notion of we're about to go take on a new project, or a project has been canceled, or etc. You want to think about how you can help them support this notion of them, that what their exact scenario is, and make sure that you recognize it's not yours, right? The don't allow yourself to get defensive and don't overreact is really saying that when you hand off a ball of energy to somebody, if from their vantage point it's really large, they might actually say things that they don't mean, right? They might actually have an emotional outburst and say things that are maybe potentially hateful, maybe potentially not nice, right? And it's very, very important for you to not remember these words for the first 3 minutes, right? Because they probably don't mean them, right? And we want to give them the space to react. And then, of course, there's follow-up, right? That says you need to help them get back, right? So you don't deliver, for example, for most people, you don't deliver challenging news on a Friday, right? As a leader, it's a bad plan. And the reason for that is that you actually want to see these people tomorrow, right? I want to know that you're okay, right? And I also want to know, what are you thinking about right now, so that I can help make sure that what you're thinking matches where I think we are, right? And if we're not on the same page, let's get on the same page, right? So you have to think about how you give them space to absorb it their way, but equally make sure that you're getting follow-up and connect back to them. Does that make sense? And then, actually, I'm going much quicker than I thought I was going to. So, a few things. Analogies are really, really powerful, right? Which is, these are useful tools to view situations and communicate. And when you think about depersonalized communication and using the pause button, where you actually can stop and look at a situation to figure out how to react to it, as opposed to just letting reaction happen, it really increases the power of your ability to both understand and influence situations. Have fun with analogies, right? There's a whole bunch of them. As I was looking at, other analogies that are in the world, and certainly those that are in the book, there's a great deal of them, but you do have to make sure that when you're using them, have fun with it, but don't use them to the point that people don't understand what you're talking about, right? Which is easy to do. So you need to make sure that you're actually communicating, but use the indirect language for the power that it has. And then, of course, lastly is, there's 9 analogies in Choose Not to Fail, and they span different scenarios, some are more personal than others. But one of the things that I want to make sure you realize is that in the book and in the analogies, I do not give an answer to a question, right? So I'm not going to tell you how you should react. I'm going to tell you, here's things to think about so that you can actually react consciously, right? And then, of course, don't dig perfect holes in the wrong place. That's a bad thing. And don't vaporize others with this ball of energy as you throw it around. Thoughts, questions?
So an online question is, do analogies work better for visual learners than verbal?
Do they work better for visual learners? Interestingly enough, I've had good luck with both, but the extent that you need to stop and talk about the analogy might be a little bit different. Interestingly, I've had a lot of people, when you speak language too quickly and you don't stop and describe the analogy, people can get lost in you're not communicating, you're using a bunch of words that don't make sense. But if you stop and actually explore the analogy to where people understand it, the indirect language turns out to be powerful. Other questions?
What led you to write this book?
What led me to write it? So the set of analogies that are in the book are analogies that I ended up using a lot as I worked with different teams and different people. And literally the thing that was the catalyst for writing it was my sister moved into a management position. And when she would come home and describe what was going on in her life, in her professional role, I started using the analogies there, and her team started asking her what book she was reading. So we decided maybe there ought to be a book. And it turns out that as I wrote them and then started sharing the write-up with people, even the write-up of it, I think appeals to a lot of people. And I can tell you, if you read the book, I think what you will experience is a couple of the analogies will probably speak to you profoundly. A couple of them won't, right? And it really comes down to where you are in your journey, right?
You gave the example of the ball of energy, and communicating some things entailed in that as you're passing this along.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like there's ways to say, if you include people in the planning process, you really kind of do dissipate the ball of energy, so you're not passing it.
Actually, that's a really good point. Yeah. I would agree with that. So if I paraphrase that back, I think you're right. Certainly there should be a line item that says, hey, if something turned out to be a huge ball of energy to a receiver, for you to think about how you could have made the ball of energy smaller by doing better and more thoughtful planning. I absolutely agree with that.
Are there ways, like for the review, are there ways to say, like a review process, if you're going to deliver a negative review, there's ways to soft pedal it where the other person can be kind of going, okay, the bad news is coming, can you just give it to me, please?
Mm-hmm.
Do you talk about that at all in the book, about how to mitigate some of these things but not appear disingenuine?
I don't, so that point directly is not. And what I would say to that is, you want to be direct and you want to get the thing on the table. But what you also want to do is make sure that you're thinking about how is this person apt to react to this? And let's make sure that when I put this on the table, that I'm actually thinking more about them than me, right? Because there's a lot of people that, when we hand off the ball of energy, we are so excited to get rid of this thing that we lose sight of the fact of what the abruptness of this journey is going to be on this other person, and how to actually say, you know what, I'm not going to think about me for a minute, I'm going to think about you. And how do we put this on a table that makes sense to you, etc., so that your journey is minimized, if you will. Does that make sense?
I had a follow-up question. Is the book about learning, applying these 9 analogies, or is it more giving examples and then we need to learn to develop the analogies?
It's more about the 9. It's more about the 9, right? And yeah.
Almost a continuation question. I'm guessing if I'm the receiver of the ball of energy, you're saying I can try to use the analogy to help the person sending the message make it clearer or easier for that person to give me whatever message it is, right?
If you're the receiver of the ball of energy, if you have this notion in your head now, and I'm going to assume you do now, is if somebody suddenly gave you news that was shocking to you, for you to realize, I just received a ball of energy and this is the way I typically react here. So this is what I'm going to go do. I'm going to tell them, thanks for sharing the news. I need to go for a walk. I'm going to come back and talk to you, because I know I need to process this thing before we can move to the next steps, right? And if you're conscious with yourself around what is the way I react here and what is the way I want to react when these happen, right? Because all of us in our journey hand off balls of energy and receive them as a matter of course, right? The point of the analogy is to make us both conscious in the way that we're handing them off and in the way we receive them, right? The analogy is not going to make it to where everybody that gives you a ball of energy is going to do it in a nice way, right? But I can choose the way I react, and I can know what is the best way for me to process this thing. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm struggling to phrase my question, but I look back, so I totally relate to your talk and your messages. But I look back when I received some of these balls of energy, and when the sender actually used analogies, it's sort of, you're very right that it diffused the situation at the time. But looking back a day or two or a month later, I find the analogy sometimes disingenuous. I find it disappointing. Except sort of regretted that, yeah.
You find it disingenuous and disappointing?
Yeah. I felt like we avoided the communication that should have taken place by using this analogy.
That's interesting. I would love to chat about an example of that. I absolutely wouldn't support replacing solid communication and sincerity with an analogy, right? The place that I use them myself is to actually make sure that we are communicating, but always bring it back to the message of we need to apply this now, and when you apply it in the real world, this is why we had this analogous conversation. But the application's got to come back, right? Because if you don't bring it back in, if you're talking about digging a perfect hole in the wrong place and you don't come back and actually talk about the hole in concrete terms now, if you don't talk about this is why I don't think the value is there in concrete terms, then we're missing something that is vital. Does that make sense?
I had I had a friend of mine who was a senior manager, and I went to talk to him for some mentoring. And now that I see your talk, I realize he was using analogies. And the analogies, when he looked at my situation, he used this analogy to help shine this observation, take us both off the ground. I really hope we did talk about the facts on the ground, but to kind of pull me out of that immediately, just the analogy was helpful. And it did depersonalize it for both of us. And I thought once the personal stuff was out of the conversation, just looking at the facts on the ground from the analogy, we could then go back to the problem that we were trying to solve. And it really did help. It facilitated the communication much better.
Right, so let me give you an example of using the ball of energy. If you're a manager and you have a lead that's working for you, and that lead needs to go deliver a tough message to somebody, right? Whatever the tough message is. For you to be able to say, listen, you've got to think about how you deliver this message. You're about to hand off a ball of energy, and here's the nuances that come along with that. Because a lot of times if we stay too direct, literally, we lose a lot of the nuance. And if I could coach that lead on what it means to hand off a ball of energy, and what are the subtleties related to it, and what is this receiver apt to go do when you hand off this ball of energy, we can have a conversation between me and this lead to help them be stronger in what they're doing, right? And the net effect is they're a stronger lead, and the person that's receiving this message ends up with a more robust situation because the person that's doing the communication suddenly could think about it first, right?
I'm curious on the analogy with digging the perfect hole, how you came to see digging a hole as the best analogy, because you're using it, it's working. I'm curious how that's been received by others, because it's not like we're building a perfect house or a perfect business, or you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
We're just digging a hole. And do you have any insight into why that works so well for people? I mean,
so
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So it is fair to say that the word perfect isn't necessarily where I put the downbeat. But I can tell you, so that analogy happens to be the oldest one in the book in terms of, so I told you that these were all invented on the job, right? And I can tell you specifically who I was talking to for each one of them. And that analogy, the reason that it came out the way it did was to get somebody to understand where you're digging is actually more important. And because everybody's trying to build, perfect might be too strong of a word, but because we all care about the quality of what we're doing, right? You guys don't get up and come toil away every day on, well, we'll just do a chip and move on. And that's the reason the word perfect got stuck in there. Does that make sense? I'm actually
asking about a whole versus making
a vertical structure of something. Oh.
Or building a bed or a palace or whatever.
Building a perfect palace on the wrong parcel.
I know certain people on my team, if I told them, hey, you're digging a hole, they would take that from a negative connotation.
Yeah, fair enough. So my guess is the reason it came out that way. It's an interesting. I haven't drilled on this one this way. My guess is the reason it came out that way is because I was talking to somebody who was thinking that their effort is all that mattered. Look at how hard I worked, and it came out that way. It's an interesting. I haven't had anybody push back on that way though. Right. So doesn't mean it's not valid, but in the journey so far. Right. Unfortunately, maybe it works because we're telling them you're putting it in the wrong place. Right. It's interesting.
Do you talk in the book about when analogies don't work or some cautions? Are there times where making up an analogy on the fly fails, or some good things to think about? Not trying to create your own, or
Yeah. Well, so in the book, no. Right, so in the book, I do not explore the theory of analogy, right? However, I would submit that you don't want to do that if it's not going to crystallize the concept that you're after, right? And I can tell you that using too many analogies that you don't stop and get a consensus over what this means can absolutely, it can breed confusion quickly, right? So. Like I cautioned, we don't want to overdo. Other thoughts?
She says that she uses analogies when she's having a disagreement, and what she wonders is people will reject the analogy as opposed to focusing on what she said is how do you get people to consider the analogy instead of rejecting it? I'm wondering if can you use analogies effectively in a disagreement?
So I can tell you that injecting brand new analogies in groups of people is going to be harder than using them in individual one-on-ones, right? Because getting a group of people that are focused on solving a problem to take this sidestep when everybody in the conversation may or may not need to take the sidestep actually will cause more confusion sometimes than not, right? So typically I would do the analogy with people as a one-on-one. So even if it means after this meeting, pulling a couple of people aside that I think were probably a little more confused than others is the way I would go about doing that.
It's interesting, I hear different accents here with asking questions. I'm Swedish and I work in the US, and it's funny, most analogies I hear are sports related in this country. You double down, you play in the team and so on. And in Sweden we use a lot of animal and actual nature kind of analogies. So maybe I did myself a bear service by asking you a question, meaning you don't ask a bear a service, you're gonna get killed. The point being is that...
Let me write that, hang on, I gotta write that one down.
I have several more ones. So it's just interesting, if you're gonna use it, you have to consider people are different, as you say, but also there's a lot of international people in Microsoft, and I think using the most expected, kind of most usual ones, you need to be careful how they're perceived, not only from personal, but also linguistic, if that makes sense, or
yes.
Cultural as well.
Yes. The cultural aspects you do have to be very, very cautious of.
Double down, I never heard of. I mean, that was apparently something very important. That was a baseball-related thing, I think, or is it basketball? Point being that...
Sounds like a Vegas thing to me. I don't know.
It is an important aspect of it, not to expect... You don't expect people to immediately understand the analogy just because you're in a certain corporate culture or...
I agree with that. And in the analogies, keep in mind that... So one of the things that I discovered in writing the book is that in the one-on-ones I did with people, where these were actually kind of brought into focus, I only talked about the aspect of an analogy that related to what this individual I was trying to communicate. right? So one of the things that I kind of discovered myself in writing the book was that some of the analogies were actually bigger than even I realized they were, because when I was using them with people, I was staying very, very focused to the issue at hand, not let me stop and tell you about this analogy and all of its, idiosyncrasies, right? But I agree, and it's a caution that I put in earlier that bears repeating is make sure you're actually communicating, right? Because if the analogy is not helping you connect with the person and helping them see something that you're trying to help them see, then you need a different tactic with this individual.
Thank you so much. Peter will sign most of the time.
Thank you.